Hey guys, in this theory in 3 minutes, we're going to look at why the chromatic scale is a scrambled spectrum of color. Why are all the colors mixed up in the chromatic scale? So to illustrate, let's look at the chromatic scale to see what it looks like and what it sounds like on the piano keyboard, for example, starting on C. These are the 12 fundamental notes of the chromatic scale, and all of the colors are mixed up. So you might wonder, why is that? If the chromatic scale, if the word chroma means color, then you would think the chromatic scale should be illustrated as a seamless spectrum of color. So to illustrate this, we have the chromatic scale as it really is, mixed up. So why wouldn't it look like this, with all of the colors laid out seamlessly from left to right in a spectrum? Now, if you think this, then you're in good company, because a lot of people picture or imagine that the chromatic scale would look like that, including Isaac Newton, who in 1704 published a book called Optics, where he basically laid out the same idea. He thought if you're going to visualize music, then wouldn't it look like the spectrum of colors? And the thing he knew about was a lot of things. He knew about the theory of gravity, came up with the theory of gravity, theory of light, calculus. So if Isaac Newton thought that, then shouldn't that be the case? Why was he wrong? And he was wrong. And the reason is because he didn't know about a pattern called the circle of fifths. The circle of fifths is basically an illustration of how all 12 keys in music overlap and form a ring of relationships. And this pattern, the circle of fifths, was not introduced to Western Europe until a few years after Optics was published. So this is the circle of fifths. You've got all 12 keys, all 12 major scales that overlap and bleed seamlessly into each other. And then you have the color wheel, and the colors in the color wheel also bleed seamlessly into each other and perfectly match the pattern of the circle of fifths. So the circle of fifths and the color wheel are essentially the same pattern. So the color spectrum applies to the circle of fifths, not the chromatic scale. So how then do we get from the color wheel, the color spectrum, to a scrambled spectrum like we see on the keyboard? And the way it works is this. Here's an illustration where we have the circle of fifths. And if we just focus on the 12 notes of the circle of fifths, we have the color wheel. And to get from the color wheel, the circle of fifths, to the chromatic scale, we basically take every other note and rotate those keys 180 degrees. And we get the chromatic scale, or a scrambled spectrum. To look at that again, let's rearrange that pattern back into the circle of fifths / color wheel, and then we'll rearrange it back into the chromatic scale. We get this scrambled spectrum. And then when we apply this pattern to, say, the piano keyboard, we get the colors laid out from left to right like this. So this is why the colors form a scrambled spectrum. Now, as one last illustration of why it makes sense to have the colors laid out like this, let's take the C note, for example, which is closely related to G and closely related to F. And if this was just a seamless spectrum, these two colors would be more greenish and would be very dissimilar to red. Likewise, G flat is closely related to these two notes, and if it was a spectrum, these two notes would be more reddish, which wouldn't really visually represent how closely harmonically related those two notes are together. So really, the chromatic scale is a very elegant, beautiful, natural pattern of colors. And once you understand how these colors really help you visualize the underlying musical patterns, it makes a whole lot of sense. So this is why the chromatic scale is a scrambled spectrum.